If that concludes those three questions. Okay, we'll now move on to the second group of three. Deputy Bannon.
Thanks very much, Chairman. I mean, this whole issue of wind energy is a very topical, controversial, indeed very emotive issue across the North Midlands, particularly counties Westmeath. And, you know, I, like many in Ireland and our friends here before us today, are in favour of development of alternative renewable energies, and this is to be welcomed. And as it has been stated time and time again, there is an abundance of available renewable energy that has yet to be properly harnessed. And what we are talking about, properly harnessing this energy. You know, my first question is in relation to the existing guidelines. Where do you see the existing guidelines can be improved? Because we're dealing with the 2006 guidelines. And also I attended public meetings where serious allegations were made in relation to very serious health problems, migraine, nausea, and indeed sleep disruption, etc. And I did, and Mr. Duncan was at one of the meetings where I requested information on evidence of serious health problems, and that's nearly 4 months ago in my own parish, and that information hasn't come to hand. And I'd just like to know, has there been a study done in relation to the serious health problems and the health implications relating to, has there been a report on the serious implications relating to health, because do we have the concrete evidence? Because that would be very, very important. The medical evidence on the wind turbine affecting people's health, people's sleep, and indeed the problems associated with shadow flicker, etc. And also it has been stated that farmers have been conned by some of those companies some of the companies that visited them and told them that they were going to sign up just a temporary lease, etc. And the blueprint shown a different result, and a lot of them are now concerned. Maybe you would, our friend Nora would elaborate on that particular topic, because there is genuine concerns and fears in that area. And also in relation to the cabling, you know, will the cabling be placed underground or placed over on overhead pylons, you know, interlinking the various industrial wind turbines that are going to be constructed? Maybe we'd like to have more information on that. And you know, I believe the local that it should be any development of any renewable resource should be developed in partnership with communities, with local communities. And has been any attempts made to have balanced debate at some of those meetings? Have the companies been invited to attend meetings and debate the issues in an open and indeed transparent manner within communities? Because I think it's important that we get both sides of the argument, because I mean, some of those parish hall meetings that I have attended, anything up to 350 people were in attendance, and there was no one from the other side putting forward an argument. Maybe you'd elaborate on that.
Your questions are on the guidelines and on balance.
And the guidelines and the balance.
Okay,
yes.
so the next two speakers in this group, Deputy Troy and Deputy Flanagan. Deputy Troy.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Just, you may be aware that I called for a moratorium prior to the summer recess in terms of through a topical debate, which was rejected by the Minister. Would the committee be confident that there might be no need for the moratorium, given the assurances or reassurances that came from the relevant Minister over the summer recess period, in terms of that there would be no export licence given until such time as the new guidelines would be in place, which I think is sometime in the second half of next year? Just in relation to the noise issue, we've heard, while this is a very important issue to everybody living in the locality, but I think it can have even a greater effect on people with autistic children or people who have sensory issues, and maybe you might elaborate a little bit on that. And just in relation to, at the outset, Darrell, you made a comment that there's over 1,000 landowners currently signed up across the Midlands in relation to looking for an option in terms of the erection of a wind turbine. Now, there's anecdotal evidence that a number of these landowners would now like to get out of these clauses, primarily due to the good work that Nora has done in highlighting the great deficiencies that are in the contracts. But why do you think then have so many landowners been signed up if what Minister Rabbitte said is accurate, and that these turbines are going to be geared or moved or persuaded to go to state-owned lands and cut away bogs? What's the reason for going through this whole process with over 1,000 landowners? Maybe you might elaborate a little bit on that. And then finally, in terms of Chris Hanning said that the ideal setback would be 1.5 kilometres. Can I ask, just in relation to I suppose when we look at never reinventing the wheel, and you look at where best practice currently exists, and Andy and Darrell will be aware of what I'm probably going to say next, because I've brought it up at numerous public meetings, and that's in relation to the Danish model, who have been, I suppose, experts in the whole area of wind energy and renewable energy going back over the past 2 decades. And indeed, Andy alluded to the fact that they have a system in place to compensate anybody who has had their property devalued, but they do also have a smaller setback distance in terms of the setback distance from the turbine from the residential dwelling. I think it's 4 or 5 times the height of the dwelling, and they have a similar settlement pattern as we have here in Ireland. So I'd just be interested to hear Mr. Boulder and Mr. Hanning's views in relation to the Danish model, what they think of that model, because that is often held up as best practice in the European Union.
Thank you, Deputy Troy. So your questions are on the moratorium, the landowner issue and the Danish model?
Yeah.
Okay. Deputy Flanagan.
Thank you, Chairman. That was an excellent presentation, and you've answered quite a lot of questions that I would have had, and many people in my locality would have had. I don't know, did you get to hear Minister Rabbitte on the radio, on the news earlier today? And Deputy Penrose was also on the news, and having listened to Deputy Penrose, I have to say I was very excited about how your issue was going to be represented and how maybe your problems were solved. But I have to say, listening to Minister Rabbitte afterwards, it was a case of going from fifth gear, high fifth gear, down to low first gear on the whole thing.
And ask a couple of questions,
so
please.
He said that he felt that he had, to use his word, I wouldn't use a word like myself, assuaged the fears of people in the area, and that really it was just a matter of misunderstandings at this stage that was driving an awful lot of it. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that? And I'm a legislator, and I suppose what can a legislator do to help you? And I would suggest is support that bill that would have distances of 1,500 metres, not elastic guidelines, but actual hard and fast rules on it. I'll gladly support it, and you need another 83 to solve your problem. So, having listened to Minister Rabbitte this morning, I know we've got one here. I don't know, do we have one in the Minister? What are have your fears been assuaged, as he said? And what are these misunderstandings? Because I can tell you one thing for sure: the people who got planning in North Roscommon and South Roscommon have not had their fears allayed, as I might say. And actually, say the cart has been put well before the horse, and we don't seem to have any way out of it. They're getting chainsaws and going out and cutting them down, and that's not a good place to be as a legislator.
Thank you, Deputy Flanagan. So there were 3 questions there. The Deputy Bannon had an issue on guidelines and balance. Who will take those, Mr. Kennedy?
Nora's going to take questions from both Deputy Troy and from Deputy Bannon in relation to contracts.
Okay, thanks very much. Ms. Fagan, thank you.
Thank you to Deputy Bannon and also Deputy Murphy, because a first very important relevant question here is the Oireachtas Convention. Just for those of you who don't know what the Oireachtas Convention is, it was brought in Denmark in 1998 to ensure access to information and public participation in decision making in environmental matters for those individuals and communities affected. And the Oireachtas Convention unfortunately wasn't brought into effect in this country until late 2012, which would be one of the criticisms actually of the 2006 guidelines, because it does not incorporate the type of consultation that is required under the Oireachtas Convention. So to go from the European example of Denmark to bring it to the local example of what's happening in Westmeath, if those guidelines had been complied with, I wouldn't have had another farmer standing in my kitchen yesterday evening, extremely distressed to discover that when he had been told that a turbine of approximately 75 metres was going to be put in his residential farm, he discovered through newspaper information that in fact the projection would be a 185 metre turbine. So that's showing how the European legislation must impact on the guidelines and must impact on the local effect on communities. So that answers one question, perhaps, Deputy Bannon, as to how, as you said yourself, the farmers had been conned. Deputy Troy asked the question as to how are farmers signing up to these options. Farmers are being advised at their doorsteps that over a period of 30 years they can expect to gain an income in the region of over €1 million if they choose to pledge 1 hectare of land to a wind farm company. However, the actual options and the leases that they sign up to are grossly different to those representations. So unfortunately, Deputy Troy, that is how so many of these options have been signed up. Farmers and rural communities are hard pressed, margins are tighter and tighter, and they see this as perhaps the means to educate their children to 3rd level or whatever it may be. The guidelines, my first criticism with the guidelines is that it doesn't, as I already said, doesn't incorporate the requirements under the Oireachtas Convention. Other criticisms would be that the guidelines don't provide for wind turbine farms of differing height, scale and output thresholds. You know, they're rather like a blunt hammer. They don't deal with the different megawatt capacities or the scale of the wind farms. They don't make any distinction between large-scale commercial operations like are coming to the Midlands as opposed to maybe community-led initiatives. The guidelines don't deal with landscape sensitivity. For example, to impose, which is how the Midlands feel, 2,500 turbines with an average height of over 150 metres is totally disproportionate to the landscape sensitivity of those counties. And again, unfortunately, the guidelines don't deal with those types of issues. Again, just to flag one other guideline that isn't dealt with is our national monuments. I mean, I think everybody is familiar with a recent profile showing a small round tower relative to the enormity and size of one of the wind turbines. And again, the impact on our tourism, on the perception of Ireland and particularly of the Midlands will be grossly distorted. You're going from a rural landscape to what is perceived to be an industrial landscape, and one of the other members of the committee obviously will deal with the impact on tourism. I think, have I satisfied the queries about any other queries?
There was another issue in relation to setback from Deputy Troy.
So just, I'll take that one, Chair, and also share obviously with Dr. Hanning, but I think it's important to state that there are obviously some claims out there which are, we've read quite a bit on the health side. There are some claims out there which potentially could be outlandish, and you know, we try to concentrate that down and look at the impact of noise and the noise on people's sleep. And Dr. Hanning, who has basically wrote an editorial in the British Medical Journal, which is obviously a journal of very high repute, in 2012, a peer-reviewed study has talked about that, and has today, and I'll also put this into the record, has shown us a paper that has come just in September, a peer-reviewed paper from Japan, showing, and I think this is, we'll ask Dr. Hanning to expand on it, but it looks at setback distance based on annoyance from sound. So you have annoyance and sleep disorders. I'll ask Dr. Hanning to expand on that a wee bit more.
Thank you. Well, perhaps I could respond to first to Deputy Bannon, who asked whether any study or report had been done. I'm not aware of any report in Ireland that's covered this. There are a number out there. What I would say is that all the peer-reviewed studies of existing wind farms have shown harm, and that includes the Japanese one that you've just seen. Bit of background, or you've just been mentioned. Background to that is about 3 years ago, the Japanese government instituted a program of research into the health and effects and a low-frequency noise of wind turbines. Reports are just beginning to come to light, and they do show that there is harm. And as has been mentioned, the study which was alluded to does suggest that a setback distance of about between 1 and 1.5 kilometres is reasonable. If I might go on to take Deputy Troy's question, he asked essentially about sensitive receptors. I think it's important to realise that not everybody who is exposed to wind turbine noise necessarily gets sick or has their sleep affected. We vary in our sensitivity to noise. Some people are more sensitive than others. That doesn't mean that they're somehow bad or mad. They're just more sensitive, just as some people are less sensitive. What we do know is that people who are sensitive to noise do tend to congregate in quiet rural areas, because it's quiet and because that's where they feel better. Hence, introducing new noise pollution into their environment is not good for them. Deputy Troy specifically asked about autistic spectrum disorder, and this is a not uncommon phenomenon, and it is certainly true that young people and children with this condition are more sensitive to the effects of wind turbines for 2 reasons. One, it's very common for these individuals to be fixated with rotating objects, and if they see a wind turbine, it can utterly distract them from doing anything else. And 2, they all have poor sleep. And if you've already got poor sleep and you're subject to turbine noise, it could be further affected. I think finally, Deputy Troy asked about the Danish scheme. Again, I think it's a political decision. If you have smaller setback distances, but recognise that some people are going to be harmed, but acknowledge that the harm has occurred and they are then appropriately compensated, that may be a reasonable answer. But until a system like that is put in place, then I think realistic setback distances that protect the vast majority of people are appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Hanning. Deputy Corkin-Kennedy. Yeah.
Two questions specifically that I asked that weren't answered, and one was in relation to the moratorium. Are the committee confident in the absence of the moratorium that the assurances given by Minister Rabbitte would alleviate their fears? And secondly, I know Nora answered it, but maybe I didn't make myself clear originally, is why, if Minister Rabbitte thinks that these turbines are going to be erected in cutaway bogs and state-owned land, why then would these 2 companies go to the trouble of signing up over 1,000 people, options on with over 1,000 people in terms of their land owned holding?
Okay, just on the issue of moratorium and landowners issue, we'll take that, Mr. Duncan.
There was supposed to be an attendance here from Crew, who were a national body. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to attend. But in relation to Deputy Troy's question about a moratorium, and were we assured with Minister Rabbitte's implementation of a strategic environmental assessment, we were certainly very encouraged. But from a Crew perspective, I know that they were very keen that this should be seen as a national issue, not just a Midlands issue. that there are any issues that directly affect the Midlands. Wind turbine problems are a national problem. They're not just restricted to the Midlands. So would we like a moratorium nationally? Absolutely. I think it would be a cleaner solution. But at the same token, we're very encouraged by Minister Rabbitt's instructions to the large multinational developers that their projects will not proceed until after there's a strategic environmental assessment. So we are encouraged, but absolutely we would like to see a moratorium. But nevertheless, we are happy that Minister Rabbitt has implemented a strategic environmental assessment. I suppose the ideal scenario is that that strategic environmental assessment should be rolled out to encompass the entire country.
I can answer your second question, Deputy Troy. The two competing multinationals in the Midlands are competing for land for export to, as part of the export project. In certain areas, we're already aware, and it's as a matter of record, I'm not saying anything unusual, that these two competing companies are already selling their options on to third-party investors. What's particularly unusual about the leases, and it's of huge concern again to the contracts, is normally in a long-term lease, all of these leases are for a minimum period of 30 years. Normally in a long-term lease, the farmer, i.e. the landowner, retains full control as to who the subsequent tenants or subtenants will be on the land. What is particularly unusual about these leases is that control on the assignment of the leases is not in the leases. Therefore, the farmers have absolutely no control over the third-party multinationals, investors, whoever they may be, who may then come in as tenants on the leases on their land. We've already seen the case up in Leitrim, where Mainstream have sold a wind farm option to IKEA. So this is about selling on. I'm quite sceptical as to whether the actual wind farm companies in themselves or the entities at the moment intend to stay on long term by virtue of the fact that they have that full right to assign the leases on to attract investors in and sell these options on the farmer's land to generate income.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, you might just touch on the issues that Mr. Bannon raised, David Bannon, about the balance of public meetings and that.
Exactly. I'd like to take very quickly two aspects. One is in terms of balanced debate. From the very first community meeting in which I was involved in April, and I believe you were there, I certainly had extended welcome by both email and by telephone to the developers, but they didn't come along. We took particular care and pride in the fact that we were based on, it was balanced factual information. Part of our objectives was to cut through the spin that we were seeing and make sure that we could get that balanced information out there. We believe that by the time we got to June, our next community community meeting, that we had a track record in balanced and open information, and yet when we extended a welcome once again, the developers didn't want to come. They stated that it wasn't the type of forum in which they want to be engaged. Just coming back to one other aspect in terms of the existing guidelines, and it also answers a question from Deputy Stanley. With regard to the bond, currently the guidelines state that the cost of decommissioning could be covered by the cost of scrap metal. Yet Nora would be very clear in terms of saying that it's the contracts clearly stipulate that they remain the assets of the development company. So I don't think that's actually feasible. But we certainly support that there should be some type of an index-linked bond put in place to cover that decommissioning. Particular fears that we would have is that with subsidies, as we see week by week, subsidies are certainly being threatened and being removed or being reduced. Technology is upgrading all the time. We don't know where we'll be a decade from now. It's quite likely there could be quite a bit of redundancy in these, and will they remain on lands? Finally, in terms of cabling, the energy companies state in their issued pamphlets that the cabling will go underground. Nonetheless, their lobby group, the IWEA, writes specifically to the county in terms of submission of the county development plan to ask the county council not to prescribe to put the cabling underground. That puts a real lack of trust in us in the IWEA. And I think another example, just to close, where the IWEA writes again to the county development plan, and I presume this is across the country, but I just have one example from Westmeath, where they state that the density of residential developments should not be a factor in the assessment of a planning application. And we believe that that's truly unacceptable.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Deputy
Chairman, in relation to what the Minister said about misunderstandings, it suggests that somehow people who are against it are misguided. And I'd love to have 100% confidence that the Minister was actually going to do something about it. but from listening to him this morning, you couldn't be that confident. Like, what misunderstandings is he on about? You're well researched. You were even very careful to couch the studies in relation to the noise, where you actually you could have come out and pushed it even further, but you've said there are limited studies in certain areas. It don't sound like people who are over-egging the pudding. So what are the misunderstandings that supposedly people who have a problem with wind farms in the Midlands have?
If I may take that one very briefly.
Thank you.
We're also unaware of what the misunderstandings are. We know that there are, the misinformation. We also see that quoted from the energy development companies, and we'd love to see what that is. As I said earlier, we pride ourselves on getting factual and balanced information out there. We did meet with the Minister at the end of July. He found our account impactful and compelling, but felt that it was a matter for the planning, that most of the issues that we were discussing were for the planning. We didn't have any feedback from the Minister at that time in terms of any misunderstandings, but we're certainly willing to deal with those at the proper time if we can hear what those are.
Thank you, Mr Kennedy. Deputy Corcoran Kennedy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for your presentation here